Welcome to another episode of HSF Conversations, where we discuss theology, spirituality, ministry, and culture. I'm Jesse Owens, and delighted to be joined today by my co-host Chris Talbot. And we're excited to have Sandra Peoples with us. She's the author of an exciting new book, helpful new book, entitled Accessible Church. So, Sandra, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. Why don't we begin with you just tell us a little bit more about yourself, maybe your current role, church involvement, education, and then what led you to write Accessible Church?
Okay. I work for my state convention, the Southern Baptist of Texas Convention, as their disability ministry consultant, which means when there's a church across the state that either wants to start a disability ministry or strengthen their existing ministry, they email me and I get to go in and help them take the next step on that. I teach classes in disability ministry at Liberty University in their School of Divinity. So it's a new minor there. It's really exciting to be part of building that program. At our church, my husband is the pastor, and so I primarily serve as the pastor's wife, and I'm a volunteer in our disability ministry. It kind of grew bigger than I could lead it a few years ago, and so I was happy to hand that off to somebody who now does it as a part-time job. And so I get to teach one of the classes in our disability ministry. And I have a son with autism, which is really kind of the why I'm in this. I grew up with a sister with Down syndrome and kind of took accessible churches for granted. The churches that I grew up in welcomed her, and so our whole family was able to attend. And then when our son was diagnosed with autism in 2010, my husband was the pastor of a church in Pennsylvania, and we kind of looked around and we thought, oh, there's no special needs families here because we weren't taking steps to make them feel welcome, to make it accessible to them. And so 15 years later, we're still helping churches take those steps. We live outside of Houston now, and we've been at the church that we're at now for 8 years. And the ministry has really grown, especially kind of as James has grown, and he came as a kid, and now he turns 18 next month, and so the ministry has grown for him, and then lots of other families that have attended. And so I wrote Accessible Church because I was hoping for more, especially normal sized churches, small to medium sized churches, to know that we didn't have to leave this to the mega churches. Every church needs to be able to take some steps of accessibility because the population of special needs families is just so high. It's a mission field, really, that exists in every community. And so my hope with the book was that it would just help churches start or take the next step of what accessibility could look like in their context.
Excellent. Thank you.
Sandra, I'm super excited about this book. I've been telling people at my church and my colleagues about it. Um, you know much more, I think, probably about the literature out there right now on disability ministry. To me, it seems like there are some really good books out there, but there's not a huge amount of literature. So could you just tell us a little bit about what you feel like Accessible Church, your book, is kind of providing in this area that maybe some other books aren't?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think there's in disability ministry, we have disability theologians and we have disability practitioners, disability ministry practitioners. And so there's books coming on both sides. There's some great theological work being done in the area of disability, but there's also we need to put what we believe about disability into practice so that it makes a difference in people's lives. So it's really kind of my hope for the book that it would bring those two streams together. So it would lay a theological foundation, but that it would give practical tools to churches who want to be able to take these steps. So there was a book a few years ago called Leading a Special Needs Ministry that B&H published. That was a really helpful book by Amy Fenton Lee. There's a book by Jolene Philo and Katie Weatherby called Every Child Welcome. Those are really helpful books, but those are now, 5, 10 years old, and we're still taking strides, and more churches are looking for not new methods, but just just how do we reach this growing community, especially the growing number of people with autism or ADHD, kind of those invisible disabilities. So my hope for the book was that it would just kind of bring those two fields together. So set a theological foundation, but really offer practical help and steps to take.
Yeah,
It,
absolutely. Go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, you talked about your involvement with local churches and helping them start or improve disability ministry. So as you kind of think about not only the churches you interact with, but maybe you're more aware kind of the broader contours of disability ministry. Give us like what you think is kind of a snapshot of disability ministry among evangelicals. Do you think that this is something that evangelicals are getting better at or improving or ministering better to families, or is it getting worse? What do you think the kind of state of things is?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's funny because I am doing I'm in a PhD program. I'm doing dissertation work. And what I'm really looking at is the history of disability inclusion over the last 50 years. So I'm thinking what has been available and what's available now. And so I was just at a research library looking at resources, and I thought the headlines from 20, 30, 40 years ago are the same headlines we're writing now. I mean, the same resources that are available. So I was encouraged to think, man, decades of work have gone into this, and what an honor it is to add my voice to this. But I also think maybe in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been fewer resources available. And I'm really interested in why that's true. I hope that as I do some research, maybe I can pull at some threads and figure that out. But there was a whole lot of momentum happening, and then it just kind of paused and stopped. And so now as church leaders, especially children's ministry leaders, are looking around, they don't feel equipped. They don't know what to do. They don't feel like they have the resources or had classes when they were in school on this. And so I feel like there's a resurgence happening right now, kind of a revival, because I think it really has to start in the heart. It has to start with ministry leaders, not just thinking what resources are out there, but taking advantage of those resources, putting them into action, taking the steps. And there's resources available, and they just have to really say, am I willing to kind of disrupt the status quo? Am I willing to make some changes in my ministry so that more families are included? So I'm really optimistic and really encouraged by what the landscape of it looks like right now. I hope that in the future it just keeps expanding, especially in college classes and seminary classes, and people in ministry get more education about caring for families and doing disability ministry. But I'm also at the same time really thankful for the decades of work that has been done that we're continuing to build on.
If you had to speculate on why that might have slowed, what do you, I know you said you're doing some research. What
Yeah,
what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know. It's so interesting. One of the things I want, and then, this, I mean, we could talk about this the whole time. I wonder if, like, that early material was really based on people with intellectual disabilities. And so you think more of my sister with Down syndrome, and how did she fit into those church structures? And we know in the last, I mean, autism numbers are increasing for whatever reason that's happening. And I wonder if that is part of the shift where churches maybe didn't understand how to talk about autism or the experiences that people with autism had. And then we've kind of got this social movement as far as autistic identity, and how does that intersect with theology and church practices. And when I talk about theology and disability ministry, I really see it as an evangelism issue, as a discipleship issue, more than a justice issue. And so that's part of it. But my focus is really feels like it's a mission field. And how do we get to families like mine and draw them in to with the gospel, the good news? And so I wonder if kind of that social justice movement influenced certain denominations like mine that kind of avoid that stream of thinking. So I don't know. It's going to be really interesting I hope to interview people who were doing this 10, 15, 20 years ago and say, what shifted? What shifts did you see? And what did that feel like as you were experiencing it? And why did we lose your voice really in this space?
Sandra, I think you mentioned this in the book. I know for sure you mentioned this in your presentation at the D6 conference, about how churches in general and pastors in general think that their churches are very welcoming to special needs families. But then when you actually interview the families themselves, it seems like that's not the case. And so there's kind of this really big disconnect. Do you think that's maybe part of the issue here too? Like maybe there's an assumption that yeah, we're accessible, but then when you actually ask those that need the access, they don't feel like that's the case.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of that can feel overwhelming because of the diversity of disability experiences. And so if you're asking a pastor, is our church accessible? They may just be thinking, yes, a person in a wheelchair could come into our worship service, right? And that's kind of where it stops. But that doesn't mean that a child with autism who is overwhelmed by sensory experiences and stims or makes noises in your service, is that person with a disability also welcome? And so just this variety of what disability means and what it looks like, and what the pastor's experience of that is, and who he thinks is ultimately kind of responsible for that. Like, how does he see his role and the children's ministry role or the family ministry role, and who kind of takes the lead on some of that? I think would be interesting to, if you really sat down with pastors and said, what's holding you back, or what are you doing and what are you not doing? And it'd be really interesting to hear those answers and see what resources they think they're lacking, but also figure out what beliefs are holding them back.
As you're interacting with pastors and churches, maybe what are one or two sort of major misconceptions that you sometimes hear about disability ministry?
I think one big one is that you have to be prepared to welcome everybody before you can welcome anybody. And so a church will say, well, we're not prepared to, maybe we don't have a sign language interpreter. And so we're not going to do anything because we can't meet that need. Or our youth ministry isn't ready. And so we're not going to take steps to get the children's ministry ready. Like, I like to tell churches, especially normal sized churches, you don't have to meet every need that you can imagine coming to your church. You just have to get to know the families that are showing up, meet their needs, and then grow your ministry from there. And so we can really be overwhelmed by this idea, like I said, of every possible disability that could come to our churches. And instead, we just need to focus on the ones God is bringing, take steps to welcome them, and then just keep expanding what we offer so more and more families like mine feel welcome. And so, that may start like at our church in Pennsylvania. When James was diagnosed, we were a church of like 125, 150, and they got good at meeting James's needs, and so we were able to host an autism support group in our church and go to autism events, because that was what we got good at, because we got good at it with James, with one kid, and then that expanded and we could welcome more families and more disabilities. So I really think just starting with the one that's right in front of you and then continuing to grow is a good way to look at it.
That makes a ton of sense. I can really imagine pastors saying, we don't have the ability to minister to all of these disabilities. So, so then that keeps you from getting started at all.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is, hey, who are the people that you're already interacting with? How can you minister to them? And I think that makes a lot of sense. And in some ways, probably seems much more freeing. Okay, how can we help the people, the families who are here, right here in front of us?
Yeah.
Sandra, this is a similar question, but what would you think are some major, maybe some blind spots in your average church? So maybe not even misconceptions, but just things that churches or pastors aren't thinking about.
I think a big one is the pastor's influence over this. And so I think a lot of pastors maybe just hand this over to the children's ministry director or the family ministry director, and they say, okay, you've got kids that are coming, you figure out how to help them, but it may not affect what's happening in the worship service or what I'm preaching and teaching from the pulpit. And I hear from other church, because I'm married to the pastor of my church, right? And so I hear from other churches, man, we really want to get our pastor on board. We really need his help. We really need him to buy into this. And so a lot of it starts with his view of disabilities, his theology of disability, his theology of suffering, even like ongoing suffering. And so when he's preaching on miracles or when he is preaching on people in the Bible who suffered and what that looked like, is he considerate of the caregiving families that are attending? Is he considering their experiences? Like, and this is kind of we were doing a parent-child dedication a few weeks ago, and I was paying attention to the language, and even in the language of it, it said, our children learn to grow and to walk and to talk. And I was like, oh, well, not all children walk and talk as they grow. And I mean, we want that. We hope that that's true. But as the mom of a kid who is 18 and only has about 150 or 200 words, how do I interpret that coming from the pulpit of this is what it looks like to grow, is you grow in all these areas all the time? And so, I think pastors can kind of reflect on what their views of disability are, and are they all about healing and kind of that old medical model where it all focused on alleviating suffering and bringing healing to the person, but instead it's kind of this biblical model of it that understands there are challenges, real challenges for people with disabilities, but also understands there's social challenges that are kind of societal, and those are the ones that we as a church can work to overcome so those people with disabilities and their families feel more welcome at our churches.
Sandra, in your book, you mentioned, and by the way, I did a teacher training recently at my church on like disability ministry for a bit, and I told them that I was just riffing from your book. So anything I said was just coming straight from your book. But you mentioned in there, and I think this is so helpful, that the goal of disability ministry is the gospel. And I just kind of assume in my mind that when people hear disability ministry, they can maybe attribute 100 other things to it, but it really is seems like it's the goal of any ministry is the gospel. So could you just elaborate a little bit on that? Like, how does that help kind of clarify disability ministry? How's that kind of keep it on track? All of that.
Yeah, I think it helps in two ways. I think one way is for ministry leaders to remember it's not about babysitting, right? We're not just creating a separate space where we put the kids or teenagers with disabilities and we just keep them happy while everybody else in the family is being discipled. Now, we want spaces where they're safe, but we also know that everybody who's created in the image of God, there is an opportunity for them to have a relationship with God, whatever that might look like. And so it's my responsibility as a church leader to speak the gospel over all of our ministry participants and teach them to the best of their ability. And so that's why I say the goal is the gospel. But I also think it's an important reminder for parents, because when we bring our kids to church, and like say at my church, we have two options for kids and teens with disabilities. So they can be part of our regular typical children's ministry and they get help from buddies to be able to participate in that. We also have a specialized environment. So it's in a sensory room, and the class is designed to meet those kids' sensory needs and their learning needs. And so a kid like James needs a specialized environment. He needs curriculum that is designed to instruct him in the gospel in easy ways that he can understand. But if I'm a parent coming in and I have a kid and I'm demanding that my child be in a certain environment because maybe my goal is socialization or my goal is that he be around all of his other friends, as a ministry leader, I can say, yeah, I love that goal too, but my goal is the gospel. And so I'm going to put him or her in an environment where they can best hear, understand, and respond to the gospel. So that helps with those conversations when we're kind of talking about what does Sunday morning look like if I have these different opportunities for this kid. Then even with the parents, I can say, our goal here is the gospel, because the kids may go to school, they may go to therapy, they may have all these other places that they go and are a part of, but at church, man, it's the gospel, and it's sometimes for some kids the only place that they're hearing the gospel. And so I want to make sure that even the parents understand that that's our priority.
we have a wide variety of church sizes, pastors who pastor churches of different size who listen to this show. So we might have pastors who are pastoring a church of 50 or some larger than that. But kind of regardless maybe of the size, what would you consider to be some kind of very basic first steps for pastors or churches that want to be more of an accessible church? You mentioned deal with the people who are in front of you. You know, what are their needs? Maybe along those lines, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I think a great first step is training your children's ministry on welcoming people with disabilities, what it looks like, and what modifications they may need. Now, disability ministry is more than children's ministry, but in most churches, it starts in children's ministry. So it's either a family that already exists in your church and then they get a diagnosis for their kid, or like we talked about, it's such a mission field. And that's a way that families come in is they have a child and they want to get back to church, but then they have a child that has these significant needs. And so even if you can't train, like at our church, I mentioned we have buddies. And so they're specifically trained. They're either teenagers or adults. We do that, but we also train everybody on best practices for inclusion. So that way, no matter what Sunday somebody shows up, whether it's expected or unexpected, all of our teachers have an understanding of what it could mean to support this kid. And so we have very practical tools available like noise reducing headphones. So if we see a kid covering his ears because the noise is too much, we offer a pair of noise reducing headphones. We have fidgets, which lots of kids are using fidgets now, whether it's a spinner or a poppet, and especially kids with ADHD and anxiety. If you put something in their hands, it helps them be able to focus better. And then we have tools in the classroom that are really helpful, like a visual schedule. And so it shows the kids what they're doing and what comes next. And you can even do Velcro. And if they Velcro dots on the back of the icons, and it says, okay, we've completed this, so let's put it on this schedule. So kids who have anxiety because they don't know what to expect, just a visual schedule can be a huge help. There's visual timers, which is a tool that I love to use. You can get different sizes of them. They're available on Amazon, and you just turn the dial and it can go, it has 5-minute increments, and it shows you what 15 minutes looks like. So it'll turn the 15 minutes red, and then you can watch that time go away. And what I love about that is if you have a kid that struggles with transitions where it's like, okay, and it's time to play, but then it's time to come sit at the table, then that visual timer helps them be able to more easily understand how much time is passing and what's going to come next. And so there's just some really great practical tools that we can put in all of our classrooms that help kids with disabilities, but then we find out that they help all the kids. All the kids do better when they're in an environment where there's a predictable schedule. They know what's coming next, and they can anticipate that there's an end to maybe the thing that they want to do less. We call it a non-preferred activity. So preferred activities and non-preferred activities, easing that transition between the two can help not only our kids with disabilities, but all of our kids.
And I would just add that, Sandra, you have a website where you offer a handful of resources for free on there. And
Mhm.
so for those listening, wanting to look for just maybe some easy things to add to their church, that's a great place to start, is sandrapeoples.com. Yeah, maybe one last question. You've mentioned a couple times throughout, and maybe I should have asked this on the front end, but you've used the term mission field. For those listening, maybe just don't realize, could you just kind of give us a general, doesn't have to be the specific statistics, but general idea of like what are the numbers related to that mission field out there? Like we're talking about trying to reach those with disabilities. How big is that demographic?
Well, there's a few stats that I go to when we talk about this. A recent census said that 1 in 5 families in the US has a member with a disability. I saw an updated number that said 2 in 7, so that's a little bit bigger than 1 in 5. I reached out to my school district and I said, how many kids do you have that have IEP plans or 504 plans? So this is the kids with disabilities, but also the kids who have learning disabilities and need behavioral support. And in our school district, it was 24%. And so that's almost, a fourth of all the kids. And so I kind of encourage churches to say, okay, it's either 1 in 5, 1 in 4, 2 in 7, whatever that looks like. If you look around your sanctuary or you look around your children's ministry, is that number being reflected? The number that exists in your community, is it existing in your sanctuary and your church? For most of us, it isn't, even those of us with disability ministries at our churches. And so I think that's why this mission field is so important. And then there was a study done on specifically on disability families and are they attending church? And so one of the things that was found was if you have a member in your family with autism, you're 84% less likely to attend church than a typical family. So autism numbers now are like 1 in 36, something like that. So 1 in 36 kids, they're 84% less likely to attend church. That's a huge number in, like I said, in every community that exists. And so, man, just whatever we can do to reach them with the gospel. I mean, raising a son with autism, if I didn't have Jesus' abiding help, if I didn't have hope in him, it would be such a harder journey. I mean, even just our son turning 18 in a couple of weeks, and there's all these steps that we have to take. And I just think, where would I be without the hope that I have in Christ, that he is with me, that he sustains me, that he has a purpose for us in this? So I think of all of that for my own family, and I multiply that by 20, 25% of my community. And I think they need what I have. They're hungry for what I have already found. And so I want to feel like a missionary when I'm out in the community, when I am in waiting rooms or I'm at the school for Special Olympics practice. When I'm out there, I am a missionary to this people group that speaks the same language that I do and has the same needs that I have. And then I'm so thankful to have a church that I can invite them to. So when I meet these families, I can say, come to our church. They care for my son and they will care for your family as well.
That's an encouraging word. Thank you so much for that. Thinking about the hope that we have in Jesus. Well, Sandra, thank you so much for joining us. And for those who are listening, as Chris mentioned just a minute ago, be sure to check out sandrapeoples.com. There's a lot of great information and fantastic resources that you can take advantage of there and pick up a copy of Accessible Church. So, thank you for listening to another episode of HSF Conversations. Again, Sandra, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you for inviting me.